It's good to see everyone.
Good morning.
And maybe in this COVID-avoided time, I learned a long time ago that when you go to Costco wearing your mask, if you don't look at anybody, you don't catch anything. So everybody just sort of walks around not looking at each other, you know, avoiding eye contact, though that transmits the disease. But I would like for you to look around. Take a moment and look around and see who's here. Sometimes we come to church and we sit in the pew, and we, particularly now when we are staying away from each other, and we sit in the pew and don't really notice that there are other people here. As we gather as the body of Christ. This week as I read the lectionary suggested scriptures for the Sunday, the scriptures that Chris read and the scriptures that I read, that I will read in a little bit, I suddenly saw that they were connected. Now sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes I look at the scriptures and I wonder if the company that put them together, the lectionary, sort of threw darts and and put together some passages of scripture so that we can. Then I look at it a little bit differently than that, but more positively. I sort of see it as it's sort of like a salad bar. You know, you can take what you want from it and introduces everyone. It helps to keep us all introduced to the variety of scriptures that we have available to us. But as I read the scriptures this week, I thought there's a connection. There's a connection between the ones Chris read and the ones that the scriptures that I'll read in a little bit. And I wondered, I thought I might give you a test and say, did you notice a connection between the passage in Isaiah and the passage in Luke? Did you notice anything that connected them? When in case you were sort of maybe tuned out when Chris was reading, because sometimes we aren't here yet, and and it takes us a while to get here. When we're here, but we're not here. Chris read he read from the Old Testament, and from the book of Isaiah, and it's a story that many of us who are in the church are very familiar with, but it's sort of a strange tale, a strange picture, a strange writing, a strange story. Isaiah is in the temple, and he probably in a vision, a dream. He has this, and it's an extraordinary dream, extraordinary encounter. It's a dream that in that vision he has an encounter with God, but not just with God, but with seraphs too, which are sort of angelic kind of creatures. Only they sound a little bit scary. The six wings, and the seraphs reach and Isaiah's feeling uneasy and unholy and guilty as he finds himself in the presence of God. And the seraph brings a coal from the fire and puts it to the lips of Isaiah, symbolizing that he has been made clean. And then God says, "Who can I send?" And Isaiah says, "Send me." And then from that first part of Isaiah, the message that Isaiah was to take to the people, he became the voice of God to the people, and it was not a pleasant voice. It was not a pleasant message that he took, but it was a threat. It was condemnation. So there was this encounter, and then there was this call. In Luke, Peter and James and John are fishing. There are two boats fishing. They're fishing. They haven't caught anything. They come in. Jesus comes along and commandeers one of the boats and uses it as a preaching area. And then after preaching, he tells the fishermen, go back out to the deeper water, put down your nets, and they did, reluctantly, but they did because they fished all day, and they pulled in a lot of fish, and that caused Peter to realize that he was the one who had given the command to go out into deeper water, was more than just a person. He had a unique relationship with God. Later, he would be called the Son of God by Peter and John and James, the fishermen. And Jesus said to them, you fish today, but we're going to fish you from now on, you're going to fish for other people. And so there was this encounter and then a call. Did you see that? Encounter, then a call. And let's look at the passage from the epistles, 1 Corinthians 5, 1 through 11. Now I would remind you, brothers and sisters, of the good news that I proclaimed to you, which you in turn received, in which also you stand, through which also you are being saved, if you hold firmly to the message that I proclaimed to you, unless you have come to believe in vain. For I handed it on to you as of first importance, what I in return had received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12. Then he appeared to more than 500 brothers and sisters at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have died. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles. Last of all, as one untimely born, he appeared also to me. For I am the least of the apostles, unfit to be called an apostle, because I persecuted the church of God. But by the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace toward me has not been in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is with me. Whether then it was I or they, so we proclaim, and so we have come to believe. Do you see how this passage connects? It's the other two passages are stories of encounter and call, and this passage is full of encounters. It talks about Jesus' encounters with his followers after his resurrection. And Paul talks about his encounter with him after the resurrection. An encounter that changed his life, that moved him from being a persecutor of Christians to being an apostle. And so there is something about, and it seems that the God that we find in the Scriptures and that we experience in our lives is a God it encounters, it reaches out to and comes to people, and it comes in the times of need, but also comes with challenges to live and to care for others and to practice justice and kindness in the world, changing the world into the kingdom of God. For Paul, the encounter with Jesus, the living Christ, was the thing that sort of certified him. And so when he goes back and he says, yes, I encountered Jesus, he's saying, yes, I too am an apostle, like these others are. Now, I wanted to, last week Adam mentioned in the 1 Corinthians, talked about a little bit about the 1 Corinthian church. He's mentioned that sort of in passing on this passage, this passage about love, the superiority of love. And I went back and I looked through the chapter. You know, that church was in a mess, you know, and there was, you know, it was a church that was prominent. It was one that Paul had founded, there were just numerous issues. Now, in Paul's letters to churches, Paul is always addressing problems and answering questions. It may be that Paul just sat down and thought, I think I'll tell them about this. You know, I think that it's more likely that when Paul wrote something, it's because someone has said, Paul, what about this? This is happening among us. What do we do about this? Or what about this? Or this could happen. Tell us more. And basically, Paul was writing back to the churches and giving them instructions and teaching them, and instructions about his ideas about how we are to live as followers of Christ in this multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic, and socially diverse, changing world. And Paul is addressing the problems that were there. Now, you know, in Corinth there was division in the church, incest, lawsuits among brothers, sexual morality. Then they wanted to know about, okay, if Jesus is coming again, what about marriage? Should we do this? What about celibacy or marriage? There's some people want to eat food that's offered to idols. What about that? What's right? What's the way to do worship? What about the Lord's Supper? There were questions that obviously Paul had received a list of, and so he's answering these questions. And so, in addition to giving advice, even instructing the people how to live each other and with their non-Christian neighbor, he's instructing people how to live with each other and their non-Christian neighbors. I was thinking what we know about that church is based on this letter, and it's almost like listening to one side of a phone conversation. We talk on the phone a lot at our house. Maybe that's true for everybody. We text a lot too. People text a lot. But is it generational that we talk on the phone? Okay, you talk on the phone too? Okay, good. Good. And so sometimes I'll come into the room and Helen will be talking to someone, and I don't know who she's talking to. I'm just hearing her responses. And so I'm trying to figure out who she's talking to from the things she's saying, and then I'm also trying to figure out what the other person is concerned about from what Helen is saying. That's a bit of the way it is when we read Paul. We don't know for sure who was asking the questions. We don't know for sure who he's describing, unless he's described them in detail. We don't know these things. We're reading Paul's epistles, and from that we're thinking we know what's going on in this other place, this place that Paul is writing to. And so one of the things that seems to be running through this conversation, and maybe it's sort of like popped up at the beginning, and then near the end of the chapter, Paul wants to say a little more about this, or either he's actually I think he sounds a little defensive to me. But in the first chapter, Paul is recognizing that in the church there's a dissonance. You know, that there are some people who say that I belong to Paul. He's the one who came and told us about the gospel. And some people say, and then others are saying, yeah, but Cephas came through, and I belong to Cephas, and that's Peter, and he was with Jesus, and others saying, I belong to Apollo. He was golden tongue. He just said it the way I like to hear it said. And so some said, and so Paul is saying, he said, this is not going to work. He's saying we all belong to Jesus. We belong to Christ. We're not, you're not followers of Paul, you're not followers of Apollo, you're not followers of Cephas, you're followers of Jesus. And so Paul deals with that, talks about that in chapter 1, in the first chapter. Then in chapter 15, he presents to the church a defense of why he has the right to be play the role that he plays in the church. And not only does he seem to be defending himself as a carrier of the gospel, as an apostle, but he's also defending the message itself, the gospel itself. And so it seems that, so he's saying at the heart of the gospel is the resurrection. And then he says, and he goes on to say, and the resurrection is known because after Jesus rose from the dead, he appeared to Cephas and the 12 and the 500. He appeared to James and all the apostles. And lastly, he appeared to me. I was like one untimely born. Now, I got to mention it here. I don't know why he didn't say, and he appeared to Mary first, and the women, and who went and told the disciples to expect a visit from the resurrected Christ. Paul knows better now. And who knows? Someone may have told him, even on pretty soon afterwards, that he should have known better. But Paul said, but for Paul, and Paul was saying to the Corinthians, I have a right to be here, and I have a right to say what I say because of my encounter with Jesus. The encounter with Jesus was like a license for him. It was an affirmation. It was the blessing that says, and it contained the call to be a missionary, the call to go out into the world. And Paul says, I'm like the least of these. I've been persecuted Christians, but by the grace of God, I am what I am. Now, I like that. I like that by the grace of God, I am what I am, because I sort of use that a lot in my life, to sort of explain some of my failures, and to myself sometimes. And I was thinking, what does that mean? When I hear somebody say, I am what I am. I think it means, I think what Paul was saying is, regardless of the criticism that you have for me, I am in this place. I am in this position. And by the grace of God, I am what I am. When I was a campus minister at Mississippi State, which is the reason you hear so much about those stories is because that was the longest chapter. That was the longest chapter of my life. Getting close here, though. Getting close to year 20 on our marriage. But when I was at Mississippi State, it was a really exciting campus ministry. And in the Deep South, the fellowship of campus ministers was really strong. And there were, and we would go to meetings, and I almost almost felt like sometimes people would look. We would bring a lot of students to our meetings because it was a very large campus ministry, and we sort of had a reputation for being one of the strongest in the country. And there were times I would look at my colleagues and I would say, I bet that person there could really do a good job with this, with this position that I'm in. And yet we had a very successful program. Probably because I had an excellent associate. But there were times when I thought, but I am what I am, and I am where God has placed me. And regardless, there may be people that could do this job better, but I am the one who is here. Now I want to just say a brief word about encounters. There are two authors that I read and draw from. One is a New Testament professor who's deceased now, Marcus Borg. Then another is a person who writes who's written a lot about the church and about how faith is changing. Is Brian McLaren. And in reading from their books, two of their books this week, I heard both of them. I read where both of them had mystical encounters with God. Brian McLaren said that his first one was when he was 15, and he remembers he was with a youth group, and they were on a retreat, and he pulled himself aside from the group, and he just felt, and he went off by himself, and he was sitting alone in the dark, stars in the sky, and he had this overwhelming sense that God loved him. And not only does God love him, but God loved everything around him. And that everything around him loved him. Borg says that twice, that in his book, his autobiography, he talks about three conversion experiences. An intellectual conversion to Christianity, an intellectual conversion, a political conversion, and then a spiritual conversion. And in his chapter on the spiritual conversion, he shares about being on twice. Once he was even on a plane, and he had this tremendous sense of peace and the presence of God. And as he looked at people around him, they even seemed to look different to him. Then Borg goes and puts a whole chapter in his book about mystical encounters with God. And I was thinking, my guess is that many of us have had, in some way, had some kind of mystical encounter with God. For me, growing, in a church where there was, and growing up in churches that stressed invitation and response, there were a number of times that my response to God was not out of guilt, but out of a sense of presence and warmth and love. And there have been times in my life when I felt a great need. Maybe my life seemed to be just falling apart. And I can remember one specific time when I did not know the next thing to do. And I had this great experience. It was like an encounter. And I sensed God sort of saying to me, take a breath and take the next step. Just take the next step. My guess is if we could sit in a circle, you would be able to share with others some of your own experiences. Now, I told you last time I preached here a few weeks ago that in our house, if I'm preaching on Sunday, it's all hands on deck all week. I'm asking Helen questions. What do you think about this? and Helen's sort of become, sort of she's a test case, and also a theologian in resident. And so sometimes, I'll ask Helen. We were talking just a day or two ago, saying about what kind of encounters have you had? And we talked about a variety of encounters. Most of them are not as dramatic as seraphim and coals and loud voices. In fact, none of them for me have been that dramatic. But there have been numerous times when I have felt that God is uniquely in my presence. This is common in world religions. Borg has some quotes from a variety of people who write about this. Rudolf Otto, who was known as one of the writers on holiness of the other, calls the experience the numinous. Abraham Herschel calls them the moment of radical amazement. Martin Buber calls them the I thou or I you moments in which we encounter what is. And Abraham Maslow calls it the peak experience. And Marcia Elliott calls it the golden world. And in the Celtic tradition, it's referred to as the thin veil and a thin place. And so, I guess what I want for myself, I want to encourage myself. I want to encourage myself to avail myself and to listen to the encounter of the holy with the holy, to listen and to be open to God crossing through the veil, the porousness of the veil into my life in a different way. So my call to you today is that I invite you to let that happen even today. We've got a unique situation, not that never happens, but it happens once a month, where we gather and we look at and we have the table before us, and in the passing of the bread and the cup, which probably are they still together, aren't they? The bread and the cup. The passing of the bread and the cup, we have an opportunity for a unique experience with God, an encounter. And if we sense it as an encounter, then let us nod our head yes if there's a question or if there's a call. Because the place that I want to